Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Tim Horgan. I am the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. We're so excited to see you all here virtually for our second World Affairs Council of New Hampshire live event. We are broadcasting again from my apartment in downtown Manchester. And we're really excited to have our speaker tonight to talk about combating violent extremism. I'll introduce her in a minute, but just wanted to tell you a little bit about the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. For those who may not know, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization that is dedicated to helping people better understand the world around them and the complex global issues going on. These days, of course, there are a number of international issues that are not getting the attention that they need or deserve. The COVID-19 crisis, of course, has taken front and center, but there are still many of the challenges that were here before and will continue past this current crisis. One thing that is of particular interest, of course, is that the US is working on taking itself out of Afghanistan and ending its longest war in its history, not getting a lot of coverage. So what we are trying to do with these online events is make sure that people are still able to be active and engaged and understand these important international issues and create a globally engaged and knowledgeable international community here in the state. And these online events also let us go ahead and engage people from around the country and around the world. Our first event had 62% of people who watched it from the US, 40% were from around the world, and only 50% were from New Hampshire. So those are some great numbers. We're really excited to be able to engage people from all over with these really interesting programs. Having said that, the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, as I mentioned, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization, and we rely on the community support in order to continue to bring these great programs to the community. So we do ask that if you are interested, if you enjoy our programs, if you want to see this community organization continue, please do consider donating to the council. If you're watching on our website, there is a link directly below this media player where you can donate after the event. We really hope that you enjoy it. You can also join us as a member. We are really driven by the support of our membership. We want to make sure that their voices are heard in all of this, and those are the people who really make sure that our organization can continue on. In addition to that, we want to thank our sponsors for our online event so far. We are very grateful to the John Bickford Foundation, to Charlie and Barbara Bickford, to Karen and Stephen Barndollar, as well as to Helen Taft and Peter Bowman. We really appreciate your support in helping us make this program possible. Without their support, we would not be able to bring these great programs, and we hope to continue to bring them to our audiences. We are also, as I mentioned, a nonpartisan organization, which means we do not take sides, we do not support positions. We are here to be the forum for you to learn from experts and to formulate your own opinions. So, having said that, the legalese is that we, the speaker's views are theirs their own and do not necessarily represent that of the council or of any of its sponsors or supporters. Okay, with all of that out of the way, I would like to introduce our speaker for tonight, Leanne Erdberg-Stedman. She is the Director of Countering Violent Extremism at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where she manages work focused on violent extremism research, practice, and policy, including serving as the interim executive director of the Resolve Network and recently as senior advisor to the Task Force on Extremism and Fragile States. Prior to joining the Institute, Leanne held several positions in the US government, including as senior advisor on the National Security Staff at the White House, counterterrorism advisor in the State Department, and special assistant at the Department of Homeland Security, Citizenship and Immigration Services. She is an amazing person with a lot of great background, and we are so excited to have her here. Let me bring her up on screen, and we will go from here. Leanne, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Tim. Good afternoon, and thank you to the New Hampshire World Affairs Council. I have to admit that my personal connections to New Hampshire have grown exponentially this month. The first being that I get to talk to you all today, and the second being that dear friends of mine and my husband just moved to Sharon, New Hampshire, and at a future time, I look forward to visiting the beautiful landscapes that I haven't seen since I went to school in Massachusetts, and my two best friends were from a border town from the Massachusetts-New Hampshire border. So first and foremost, I hope that you and all of your loved ones are safe and healthy during this pandemic. I'm really glad to be able to talk to you all virtually, but not without the recognition of the challenges that COVID-19 is putting us all through. And then the second is I hope that you all can be patient with me for my first time on a video address presentation. I promise that I'm trying my best and trying to make this the least awkward as possible. So as Tim said, my name is Leanne Erdberg Stedman, and I'm delighted to be here this afternoon to talk about peace and people power and violent extremism. I have the honor of directing the U.S. Institute of Peace's program on violent extremism. So first, a little about USIP. The U.S. Institute of Peace is a national, nonpartisan, independent institute. It was founded by the Congress 35 years ago, and we're dedicated to the proposition that a world without violent conflict is possible. And also, it's practical and it's essential for U.S. and global security. USIP was created in the 1980s and signed into law. But that creation only happened after over a decade of a peace movement, including from champions who were veterans of the wars in Korea and Vietnam, and were committed to the notion that the US needed to be able to wage peace as effectively as we wage war. So USIP is a working symbol. We work every day to promote the American commitment to peace. So what do? Well, we work in conflict zones abroad. The Institute works with local partners to prevent and mitigate and resolve violent conflict. We work on peace deals and peace accords, on mediation, on negotiation, on dialogue. We feel the need to reduce future crises, and we see how costly military interventions are. So USIP works on prevention. We work with governments and civil society to help people solve their problems peacefully. The Institute also provides expertise and training and analysis to support those who are working to build a more peaceful and inclusive world. So at USIP, we see how the rise and expansion of violent extremism continues to pose a significant threat to global peace and stability. So what me and my team are able to do every day is work to deepen our understanding of what is violent extremism, how it contributes to conflicts, and what makes communities resilient in the face of violent extremism. A question that I'm often asked is whether or not there's a definition of violent extremism, and my answer is deeply unsatisfying, which is that there are several. We recently even published an article that detailed how diverse the many global definitions are of violent extremism. But I can tell you how we see it. We see violent extremism as those who encourage and perpetrate violence in order to create a new political order. And that order is one that denies individual liberty. It denies equal rights to citizens of different religious or ethnic or cultural or economic backgrounds. As we see it, extremism is absolutist and totalitarian. It's not unique to any one culture, religion, or geographic region. It's only unique in that it's their way or the highway. So our work looks to unpack the many aspects that contribute to violent extremism. We focus on three key areas. First, we run a research consortium called the Resolve Network, which stands for Researching Solutions to Violent Extremism. It's a network organization of many different organizations around the globe, as well as individual scholars, where together we're able to highlight how rigorous and cutting edge and policy relevant research is needed to help people make the best decisions in complicated environments. The second thing that we focus on is we help equip peace builders in conflict settings with tools and with techniques that can help them prevent violent extremism in their communities. Specifically on my team, we're building our knowledge and practice on how people disengage from terrorism and how communities can reconcile with those who have formerly been part of violent extremist groups. And third, lastly, we help enhance know-how through training and trusted partnerships with the US government, with the UN institutions, and others so that they can make better decisions about violent extremism. At USIP, we focus on areas outside of the United States. So let me be frank, we do not study violent extremism within the domestic US. That said, we do try to keep as informed and as abreast as we can on the latest scholarship and information, as terrorist groups often do not respect borders in the ways that we do. So why do ordinary people join terrorist groups? Before I joined the Institute of Peace, I worked in the federal government, and though I held several different positions over about a decade, many of them focused on counterterrorism. And about 6 years ago, I worked on a comprehensive literature review. Basically, that meant that I read dozens of articles and a few books, and they were all trying to put together different pieces of research that looked at terrorism and on violence. And now that I helped direct the Resolve Research Network, I can tell you that at the time, there wasn't nearly as much information as there is today on the topic, thanks to a variety of scholars' hard work on studying terrorism and extremism. But at the time, I was really struggling for some type of unifying archetype or concept that would help make sense of all these disparate pieces of research that I was trying to synthesize. And I ended up circling around Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So Maslow was the American psychologist who said that all humans have this hierarchy of needs. At the bottom are your physiological needs, like food and water, and then we move to your safety needs. And after that, there are needs for love and belonging, eventually self-esteem, accomplishment, and at the highest level, self-actualization. And what I was realizing is that violent extremist groups and terrorist groups are incredibly opportunistic. So whatever your need was, from the very bottom to the very top, they were going to be able to tailor that message that what they represent, radical change, was the answer to your deficiency, is the answer to whatever that need was going to be. This is highly adaptable, which means it wasn't the same siren call for every person, which helps explain how many groups have been able to take people from all different walks of life in so many different contexts and bring them into their radical narrative. They have one constant, and it's basically this: there's an illegitimate status quo, and my way is the best way to get you to a better life. And so what I was learning from the literature at the time, I have come to know since more directly, especially from people who were once part of terrorist groups, like Jesse Morton, who was once a jihadist propagandist. At the time, he was known as Yunus Abdullah Muhammad, and he ran Revolution Muslim in New York City, which connected Al-Qaeda's ideology and transformed it into English language propaganda. Jesse was arrested and incarcerated and changed his life. But the first time I met him, I was struck when he talked about some of the ordinary things that he did with recruits and like-minded followers. He said that they had a weekly pizza night, and they had developed a brotherhood, like a family, for many who didn't have one. Jesse now runs parallel networks, an organization that he co-founded with the former New York City Police Department official that had been monitoring and ultimately arrested him. And through Jesse's initiative, Light Upon Light, he's devoted to combating polarization and hate and violent extremism by providing the same sense of identity and meaning and significance and camaraderie that extremists provide their recruits. So terrorist organizations, perhaps by knowing it, perhaps unknowing, were operating on three very different levels when they're trying to recruit new followers. The first is at an individual level. The second is at a group level. And then the third is at the societal or structural level. And this is some of the thinking that has informed how we're looking at this challenge. So at an individual level, we are learning from neuroscientists who have come to find that humans have so-called sacred values. These are moral values that are non-negotiable and inviolable. They can be religious, but they can also be secular. The basic idea of a sacred value is that this is something that you are not willing to negotiate under any circumstances. For some people, it's maybe a sense of justice. For others, a love of country. And I think for some, it might even be your favorite sports team. But why this is important on the individual level is that sacred values are processed in a different part of your brain than cost-benefit analysis. And neuroscientists were able to see this when they put violent extremists into an MRI scanner. So how an individual feels about a specific cause matters. Second, on groups, there are countless examples and studies that show us we are willing to do things in groups that we are unwilling to do alone. Basically, we have 100 years of scholarship that show that we are willing to do something in a group regardless of if we have a rational basis for what we are doing. We're willing to do it when we do it with one another. And I think this is an incredibly important level of understanding on the group dynamics of extremism. So not everything is someone's individual choice. Some things we do in groups as a group. And lastly, on the structural or societal level, we have to see how there are decisions that are outside of your individual or even your group's ability to impact. Some things are constrained by bigger societal forces, your left and right boundaries, so to speak. And that there are things that take much larger bits of collective action in a systemic way in order to understand how the world works and what changes might be possible. These levels help us understand why building resilience is so integrated. It's not just a simple equation of meeting an individual's needs or changing how a group behaves. In order to build resilience, we have to simultaneously think about individual grievances and group needs like social cohesion and societal needs like inclusive and transparent government decision-making. For me, I saw these multiple levels intersect firsthand when I learned about and then later had the opportunity to meet one of USIP's Generation Change Fellows. Her name's Munira, and she lives in Mombasa, Kenya, which is on the east coast of Africa. She worked with youth who were often seen by others as a risk, as a youth bulge, as a problem to be solved. But with USIP, she pioneered participatory action research, which means that she was able to elevate the voices of youth as active producers of knowledge, to hear directly from them on what are their needs. Munira later joined her state government in Mombasa, Kenya, to help continue encountering violent extremism, and doing so by empowering youth to find their own community, to design their own peace and cohesion, and put them in the driver's seat as change agents. I saw how Munira's work was able to cross all three levels. Because for a long time, the job of countering terrorists has been the work of governments, of military raids and of intelligence wiretaps and of police disruptions. But what this government-only conception of counterterrorism misses is the power of ordinary people to be part of the solution. So I see three ways that civil society are part of this preventing violent extremism solution. The first is that they can develop alternative channels for nonviolent conflict transformation. The second is that they can provide powerful, positive psychosocial benefits that are associated with being part of a movement or of a peace-building effort. And third, they can help build social resilience that provides avenues for strengthening human dignity and making sure that local people are in the driver's seat of deciding their own future. Every day, civil society actors are preventing violent extremism. They're building resilience in their own communities. And what's interesting about this intersection is collective action, that which is taken in solidarity with fellow citizens, can feed a lot of the same psychosocial, group level, and structural level needs that extremists prey upon. Take two towns in Tunisia that were recently featured in a USIP report on preventing extremism in fragile states. Those two towns, Sidi Bouzid and Metlawi, are alike in many respects. They suffer from some of the same social and economic challenges. They have a shared tribal heritage and were centers of political resistance. But they also had some stark differences. In Sidi Bouzid, extremist preachers gained control of many of the town's mosques, and they ended up sending dozens of fighters to join ISIS in Syria. Conversely, in Metlawi, no mosques were taken over. Only one person left the town to join ISIS. There are many things that account for these two towns' differing ability to resist extremism, but one of them is Metlawi had a historic presence of labor unions, which gave citizens an avenue to express their grievances and a mechanism to seek redress. On the other hand, the people of Sidi Bouzid were without these established ways to organize and express collective discontent, which we think left the town more susceptible to extremist infiltration. What I think this example helps demonstrate is that the presence of civil society institutions that give people outlets to express their grievances allows communities to address problems and hopefully resist extremism. And by putting ordinary people at the heart of prevention, it enables action because collective action can make a difference on the big stuff, on the structural pieces. At the same time, whether through youth advocacy groups or through organized boycotts, people can find that their group and the bonds of belonging that only happen when you are able to struggle together. So this is able to fulfill some of those same individual level characteristics regarding sacred values and the things that you believe to be inviolable, like freedom or liberty or democracy or whatever it might be, that you and your group are trying to make a more permanent feature of your society, and you're doing it together. When it comes to putting ordinary people at heart of prevention efforts, we are also embracing a wider humanistic lens that sees violent extremism at its core as a deeply human problem, but that it's also a form of solvable conflict, because ultimately, terrorist groups only exist if people join or unite with them. And terrorist groups get this. They see human needs. They use trust and belonging and empathy and identity in their narratives and in their recruitment. They speak to individual grievances, to being a victim, to your social orientation, and they cloak their hate and violence in sacred values like justice and righteousness. But let me be clear, they cannot have a monopoly on using humanity as their message, because we stand for so much more. We stand for peace and for prosperity and for humanity and for equality and for inclusivity and for resilience. And I believe that we all have a part. And so here's my call to action to everybody who's tuning in today. I think part of this is that we can look beyond the headlines. So please come and check out the USIP resources on usip.org or on the Resolve Network at resolvenet.org. Please think about how to become curious about new topics, be humble about the limitations of our knowledge, and take the time to learn something new about something you didn't know. And then perhaps I'd like to come full circle, because I got to tell USIP's story at the top, and maybe I'll try and bring it back with it at the end. So USIP has an origin story that shows that peace takes action, that people have agency and must be a part of any real and lasting peace, that it can't just be top down. Those elected to power can do a lot, but they can't do it on their own. And we can't do everything bottom up. Some things need more than just individual action. So it's the marriage between the two that matters. So USIP's foundation took action from the Congress, but it also took ordinary peace movements in cities across the US to make it last. And this perhaps reminds me of where we find ourselves today, that people still have so much agency, even during these trying COVID times. And I hope that we're all using that agency to somehow do our part and somehow make positive change. So with that, I want to say a big thank you to Tim and to the New Hampshire World Affairs Council, and over to Tim to moderate a Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you, Leanne. That was wonderful. We really appreciate you taking the time to share this information with us and with our audience. So I know we have a couple of questions lined up here, so we might as well jump right on in. I will mention to everyone, please, if you have a question, you can interact with us via our Facebook page, our Twitter, or our email address, council@wacnh.org. We would love to hear from you, and we'll go ahead and get as many questions as we can answered here. So you talk about how extremists are using sacred values to recruit people. How are they using these values, or how are they getting around these values when they're recruiting?
It's a really good question. I think that some of the ways in which they're using sacred values is they're trying to tap into these type of moral or otherwise inviolable values in how they think about recruitment. So they say, if they know that justice is a particular sacred value, then they're trying to play to a sense of injustice and how unjust it is that you were suffering from corruption at the hands of a corrupt cop that shook you down, or that that you had been wrongly imprisoned and never given a fair trial, or the like. And so they'll take an individual experience, but they'll try and tie it back to the part of the sacred value that they know is going to resonate with your more emotional self. So I don't have all of the ways in which they do this, but we have seen, at least from the firsthand accounts of individuals, of how they really are able to make these sacred values resonate and see them more permanent fixtures of why you have to join the cause. Okay,
and this presentation is titled People Power. So how can we as communities work to point out these falsehoods, misrepresentations, etc., of those values as a way to combat what's going on around the world?
I think that's the exact right question to ask. There's part of it that is pointing out the falsehood and misrepresentation. And I think that there's a lot of ways in which we can try and, what I would say, fight facts with facts. But the thing with sacred values is sometimes it's really an emotional space that somebody's in. And so sometimes it's just a bit more humility of like, I understand why you think that that was really unjust. And I hear why that must have felt that way to you. But there's a more non-violent alternative way for you to redress that injustice. And so it's not just fighting facts with facts, but it's also fighting empathy with empathy. Because one of the things that terrorist groups have done a really good job at is making people feel heard and making them feel included. And so many times when we try and point out falsehoods and misrepresentations, we forget that we're not just talking at somebody, but we need to meet them where their current viewpoint is, and then help them by approaching it with empathy to seeing that there's an alternative way to think about the situation.
Yeah, I think the idea of approaching these conversations with empathy is great, and is something that a lot of us can use in our daily lives when we're perhaps talking about with someone from the other political spectrum, not necessarily an extremist group, but just your uncle or aunt who may not share the same values as you do. So I think coming at these conversations with empathy is definitely a great way to go. So another question we have is, while we know extremism occurs everywhere, are there any trends or similarities to the conditions that are ripe for extremists and extremist views?
Yeah. So about a year and a half ago, the U.S. Institute of Peace was home to a task force on extremism in fragile states, which was requested by the U.S. Congress for the Institute to house this. And one of the things that we recognized when we were able to bring together real world-class experts to be part of this task force is that there are a couple conditions that seem to be prevalent in many different situations, and they all circle around what's called the social compact, which is basically a citizen's relationship with their government. And in places where the social compact is deeply broken, where citizens have no trust with their government, that they feel like there's corruption or injustice or brutality or abuses, that those are the places where extremists will often be able to have more of a foothold. And one of the other things that we saw within these fragile contexts is the persistent presence of alternative forms of security. We're able to really find the seeds of discontent in a lot of these areas. And so it's not an altogether bulletproof trend, but if you look around the world over the last 15 years to many of the places who have suffered from the most terrorist attacks or had the highest presence of known terrorist networks, they are the places where this broken social compact plus a presence of militias and other alternative forms of security actors were both present. And then the last thing that I would mention is that ongoing conflict often breeds extremism. And so we've seen this bear out in the data over the last several years, that the places with some of the highest per capita numbers of terrorist organizations are the places that have ongoing civil war and civil conflict, like in Syria and in Afghanistan and in Iraq, in parts of northern Nigeria, in Somalia, in Yemen, so in Libya. These are places where the conflict of a broader sense also brings out the violent extremism.
Okay, so you had mentioned that there is a lot more information out today, a lot more research about extremism, even then more than just 5 years ago. Why didn't this explosion of research happen sooner, particularly after 9/11 and the early 2000s, where we saw really the violent extremism sort of jump to the forefront?
It's a really good question. I think that over time, the elevation of research sometimes is a little bit slower in times of immediate crisis. And so what I mean to say by that is, in a government decision maker's mind, in the immediate space of a crisis, you want to get as much fast action as possible. And I think that the funding for research was something that was perhaps a few steps behind. And then the second thing on research is that there's usually a lag time. So the days in which it's originally funded and commissioned is not necessarily when it becomes publicly available. There's usually quite a bit of time for the study, the analysis, the publishing, and the like. So I think there's a combination of their it wasn't as immediate, and then there was the lag time. Now we sit upon a treasure trove of information. We hosted an event last September at the Institute of Peace in which one of the preeminent scholars on violent extremism called this the golden age of terrorism research, because we now have so many different studies that can help understand all of the different facets. But the last thing I'll mention on kind of the volume aspect is there's also a quality part of this. So for a long time, when we were looking at terrorism through the scholarship of the 70s, 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, it perhaps was a narrower definition of what looked like a terrorism study. And as we have grown the aperture to think about prevention and disengagement as also being important to how we understand terrorism, there have been new types of studies from psychologists and sociologists and social workers and the like, that there's many other disciplines that I'm not recalling right at this moment, but have now been part of that cadre of literature that's now at all of our disposal to make better decisions.
Sure. So you mentioned earlier that people really have the power to make these changes. That the role of the government has traditionally been, police and military action. So the question we have here is, what is the role of the government in all of this? Are military tactics effective?
So the role of the government in all of this has to remain constant. I think that there is some, as I was talking about the social compacts before, how governments are able to protect their citizens is implicit in all of the social compacts. There's philosophers from the 1700s who would tell us that this is the genesis of our doctrine of governance, is that, by giving up some freedoms, you are given some protections. And so government should continue to have a variety of different roles, from the protective value that the military and intelligence community and law enforcement and others have in disrupting active terrorist plots and those who are trying to commit immediate acts of violence. But there are also roles for the government to empower civil society to do more as well. And I think that over time, governments here in the United States and around the world have realized where their role is as a champion as opposed to the primary actor. And that there are certain things that civil society organizations are always going to have the local know-how, they're going to have the credibility, and it's not going to, not everything has to be done from a centralized position. And so part of it is giving civil society organizations the space and the freedom and the trust to do what's best in their local circumstances. And unfortunately, too often, some of these conversations are really fraught, because civil society organizations in many parts of the world suffer at the hands of the government. They're pursued as political opponents. They're pursued for asking for more freedoms and more dignities. And so this is not, I don't mean to say that this is an easy proposition, but the more that governments can deeply believe that citizens are a part of this solution, I think that we can see more ways in which the government is not just having to act as the firemen to put out all of the different fires, but really can help much earlier on in maybe allowing people to install their own smoke detectors.
Okay, so I knew we would get a coronavirus question eventually, so let's jump right in. Could you share with us your assessment of the risk, if any, that the social and economic disruption caused by coronavirus will exacerbate these tendencies?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that I think anyone in my shoes has been thinking about, and I'm going to do what I hope is the most diplomatic deflection that I can, which is I've spent a lot of time over the last couple of weeks reading other people's assessments of this, and I found a lot of them to be quite good. There's been some analysis from the Tony Blair Institute on how various extremist groups are looking at the COVID and trying to take advantage of it. it. There have been some really interesting bits of information published by the Anti-Defamation League, and they've been trying to see how far-right nationalist groups and white supremacist groups might be trying to take advantage of COVID-19. And then I've had some scholarship from some of my colleagues at USIP who have really talked about how fragile states and those that already are troubled by a variety of social economic challenges are going to be hit harder than others, particularly in places across the Middle East and in Africa. And so instead of giving my own assessment, because I'm not sure that I have been able to synthesize all of these different pieces, I would really encourage a deep and hard look from those who are taking that analysis to it. And maybe my one gut instinct on this is I think that COVID-19 is going to forever change our conceptions of national security. And I hope that it helps us embrace more of a concept of human security. I had remarked, it was last week now, that unfortunately more Americans had died, and that number has now increased multifold, but at the time had died from COVID-19 than had died from the 9/11 attacks. And that was such a stark shock to my system, who I spent so much time devoted to counterterrorism, to realize that disease, that a novel disease could wreak so much havoc in so many different parts of our country all at once. And so I do hope that this is a reckoning point for us all to think more about human security.
All right, next up, this sort of builds off of that question. John Sullivan would like to know, have you looked into the economic dimension of this all? For example, lack of opportunity, being trapped in the informal economy, etc.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it's something that scholarship has been mixed over the years on this. So there have been some studies that have found no link between economic opportunity and those who are driven to violent extremism. There are studies that have seen that the combination of economic links plus ideological connections end up being a potent way in which violent extremist groups are able to operate. And I think there is no easy answer to this. I think people can broadly say that poverty does not drive violent extremism, but you can say that for a lot of phenomena related to violent extremism, because it's a low incidence phenomenon, which means that the vast majority of people who experience the same exact circumstances are never going to join violent extremist groups. So one of the ways that I think we can think about economic opportunity is in the context in which it happens. Is economic opportunity part of your identity? Are you required to be the breadwinner? Is it the way in which you get the dignity of work that allows you to mature into the next level of your society? And when your economic opportunity is more than just your livelihood, which I think for most contexts around the world, it's a complicated picture. I think at that point, economic opportunity is not just how much money you have in your bank account or in your back pocket, as it might be, but it's also the way in which you have your life's work. And in that case, the economic opportunity analysis of violent extremism becomes a much richer picture in which we can't just look at per capita GDP of a specific place, but we actually have to do the more anthropological analysis of what do different roles and jobs look like in a specific context.
All right, we've had a couple of questions that are similar here, but people understand that you don't focus on violent extremism in the US, but do you see any similarities between the processes informing violent extremism, which you outlined today with groups in the US? And then as well, why does the US Institute of Peace not focus on extremism in the United States?
Yeah, so I'll take the second one first and then the first one. So we were founded by the U.S. Congress, and it is in our charter that we are focused on conflicts abroad. So we have a very similar legal footing that the State Department or the U.S. Agency for International Development or the military has, which is our efforts are focused outside of the U.S. Our exception to that, and I think actually what I'm doing today as part of it, is that we do have a specific mission on peace education. And I think that's part of our origin story of how we see that the American commitment to peace has to be part of how we approach solving violent conflicts abroad. And so we, through our public education program, we work with teachers around the world, we do engagements like this, and we realize that the championing of our work has to have a domestic tie-in. On what we know about violent extremism and whether or not it applies to the US. So most scholars don't have the same legal distinctions that the Institute has. And so when we're looking at the consumption of knowledge from a lot of people who have studied violent extremism, we're still consuming information from US-based studies, as well as those that are studied abroad. So even though we would never commission a study here in the US, we would only commission studies abroad, we still can benefit from the world of scholarship that happens here. And I think sometimes the US is actually quite a bit on the cutting edge of understanding violent extremism in ways in which we can understand it based on other challenges that we faced. And so, for instance, there's really good scholarship from the US on cults and gangs and how we can learn from what it's like for people who are part of a cult or people who are part of a gang and how they leave cults and leave gangs and how that might impact how we understand violent extremism. And so on the question itself, the specific thing that I might add is that the presence of grievances that are at that group or societal level look different in every different society, but we still can see that those grievances exist. And then some of the other things that we're seeing in the US and in places around the world, so we have kind of this complementary understanding, is the presence of trauma. So that's trauma of individuals before they join violent extremist networks. And we have seen this again from the US case studies as well as from those around the world.
Okay, so this was a bit of a long question, so I tried to distill it down. So I hope I distilled it correctly for our questioner, but would the actions of the US around the world categorize it as a violent extremist group? So I think they're talking about military actions and coups and that kind of stuff that the US has been involved with over the years.
I would say categorically no. Under the definitions of violent extremism as we've come to understand it, that it is a group of people who are willing to take violence in order to impose a totalitarian and absolutist understanding of the society in which they're operating. That doesn't absolve any country, including the US, from taking additional care in the ways in which it prosecutes any crimes, including those that are prosecuted on a military battlefield, to do everything that it can to prevent civilian casualties, to make sure that we are only targeting legitimate targets that are actively plotting violent extremist acts and terrorist acts. So I think that there is a lot that the US has done to improve practice and can continue to do to make sure that we are not having any actions that are discordant with our ambitions. But I would say that the US, as it defines national security objectives, is defining them to have the world to be a more free and democratic and peaceful and prosperous place, which I don't think is the case of violent extremist groups.
Okay. In your studies, have you unearthed any political leaders who have been particularly effective at limiting the growth of extremism in their borders?
I don't think I've seen any that have done a specific case study of connecting the political leader to the extremism in their borders. But there are some classes of categories that political leaders can do that I think are better. One are political, and this ties a bit to the last question in some ways, political leaders that put primacy on human rights, and those who are trying to protect the rights and the dignities of individuals tend to fare better in terms of violent extremists being able to radicalize and recruit people within their borders. The second is connected to governance. So places that are able to tackle corruption, that are able to curb abuses, that are able to provide a sense of justice and a sense of dignity and the like, they tend to fare better as well. And then the last point I'll say is on transparency, and that there's a really important place for the government to be really honest with citizens about what it's doing, and that's honest about the things that it does well, and that's also honest about the ways in which it's learning lessons. And I think that people have a part in this too, which is to not constantly be looking for the gotcha moments with the government and allow governments to have that two-way transparency so we actually can learn the lessons and then apply those lessons. Because if every lesson is just a headline of failure, then we're not able to get that compact back in the right space.
Okay. So we have another question here. Can you elaborate more on the research network and if/how universities are playing a role? Also, who are your biggest partners in countering violent extremism worldwide?
Sure. So the Resolve Network is about 5 years old now. It was started in 2015, and it was launched by a variety of different international stakeholders, including with champions at the State Department and at USAID, in an idea that there were a lot of research organizations around the world that were studying violent extremism and were trying to translate the findings that were happening in applied context, but also in academia, and bring those back to government policymakers. And so the idea was that by connecting a lot of these network organizations, that we'd have a more cohesive picture of all of the different types of research that was happening. And so there are members in the Resolve Network that are associated with universities. And then we also have individual scholars that are part of the network that are also permanent professors at universities. But that's not the whole of the network. I think the whole of the network is even bigger than that, because we are avid consumers of a lot of scholarship that comes out of university spaces. And I would encourage you to check them out at resolvenet.org and be able to learn more about that. I've now forgotten the second part of the question.
Sure. I think this is the right one.
Oh,
yeah, who are your biggest partners in countering violent extremism worldwide?
Yeah, so from a research perspective, we have several partners that have been with Resolve from the ground floor. So we are partners with organizations like the one based out of the UK, the Royal United Services Institute, which has been providing scholarship on security issues for decades, if not perhaps even a century by now. And world-renowned organizations like the International Crisis Group, and I'm trying to think, we are big partners with the Hidayah Center, which is based in the United Arab Emirates and has been a CVE Center of Excellence that was started by the Global Counterterrorism Forum and the like. But we're also partners with a variety of locally focused research organizations like the Kosovar Center for Security Studies, which is in the Western Balkans, or the Afghanistan Research Unit based and focused in Afghanistan. We have, I think, over 25 members, organizational members. We have over 40 individual scholars that are associated with the network, and we're growing. We've been taking new applications and the like. And so I hope that we continue to be able to grow from the Resolve perspective. And then just a few seconds on this. So the Institute of Peace also has partnerships that are broader than just our violent extremism program. And we have partnerships with other peace institutes all around the world. We have partnerships with various UN actors and the like, and we have a very talented and dedicated director of international partnerships who tries to make sure that we are tying into some of the most urgent peace-building challenges all around the world with like-minded organizations.
So I think this next question is a good clarification question. We've experienced terrorism and violent extremism throughout the world. Does the U.S. Institute of Peace only define it as being conducted for the purpose of totalitarianism?
Yeah, I don't want to be like mincing words too much on this one. It's a tough question to get accurately, but what I would say, the definition that we put in this fragile, our task force on extremism in fragile states, which is where I draw the definition from, focuses on the totalitarianism as more of the means by which the group operates as opposed to the objective of the group. And so these groups, when you observe and analyze them, whether it's ISIS or Boko Haram or the like, they operate as totalitarianisms, even if their objective is not, their charter doesn't say we aim to be totalitarianists. But when I say they operate that way, it's that they reject any notion of whether it's dissent or alternative viewpoints. They reject any notion of people being a part of these groups that aren't 100% in the exact way and form in which they have predefined. And so even if they don't self-identify their objectives as totalitarianism, they kind of operate that way.
Okay. Does the U.S. Institute of Peace host events in D.C. and around the country people might be able to participate in?
Yes, absolutely. So before the COVID times, we have our wonderful headquarters building is on the National Mall. We are right across from the Lincoln Memorial, and we host public events all the time. They're regularly broadcast on our website on usip.org, and you can find recordings of almost all of our public events on our YouTube channel as well. We also do select both public and invite-only events across the country, and we have a wonderful public education team that has both a part of our website, so you can go and explore and see what some of our public education looks like. And during these COVID times where we are implementing social distancing, we're still hosting virtual events. So hopefully this is a good experience of the virtual events, but we're still hosting some virtual events at USIP, and hope to continue to be able to do more and more of those.
All right, I think this is going to be our last question, and I've been saving it because I think it's a good one to end on. What can the people of New Hampshire do to help prevent extremism, particularly in this time of social distancing, where isolation and radicalization may occur?
I think it's a really great question. And I don't know that there's any one thing that anyone can do, but maybe I'll go back to the potential power of seeing things at the individual level more than anything, and which is meeting people where they are about the things that they're frustrated with and figuring out ways to understand individuals' frustrations. I think that during this time of social distancing, we are perhaps also slowing down a little bit and maybe can take the time to understand why somebody doesn't just have to go to a virtual space to feel heard and loved for the first time by strangers, but are there people who are close to that person who can have them feel some of those same pieces? And so that's going to look really different for each individual. And there's no at-risk profile that is going to be able to say this person is turning to violent extremism. They're spending too much time, in online or what have you. It's not going to look the same for every person. But I think that there are ways in which, if we can rehumanize one another as much as possible, there may be ways in which we can have those conversations, learn what their grievances are, and show them that the violence that their online friends are purporting is not going to get them anything more than more anger, more pain, potential arrest, and that it's a way in which taking their inner challenges and externalizing them, that there might be a more productive way. Not for everybody, but hopefully for some.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Leanne, for this wonderful presentation. We got through a lot of questions, which is great. I really love the interaction. I love that we've seen so many people engage with us, both on our Facebook page as well as our website and through YouTube. We really appreciate everyone joining for this event. We will be hosting our next World Affairs Council of New Hampshire live event on April 22nd. We will be speaking with Dr. Soner Kagapte. He will be talking about rising authoritarianism in Turkey, which should be a very interesting and engaging presentation. So thank you again to Leanne. Thank you to everyone for joining us. We really appreciate it. If you are able, we know that there are a lot of wonderful organizations out there, but if you are able, we would really appreciate any support that you can provide the council to help us continue to bring these great programs, bring wonderful speakers like Leanne to the state, as well as to the wider online community. Anything that you can do to help us continue to bring these programs would be greatly appreciated. Also, please do make sure that in this time of crisis that you stay safe, that you stay healthy, you wash your hands, follow the CDC guidelines, etc. And we hope to see you soon live and in person once it is safe and available for us to do so. So thank you again. Have a wonderful night and a great weekend.